Gouritsmond, a seaside town tucked at the mouth of a river, where the land sighs into stillness. Fishermen cast quietly into the surf. Retirees tend to tidy gardens. Here, life is measured by tides, and time moves at the pace of rust on a tin roof. It's the kind of town where nothing much ever happens until something does. In September 2019, a man was found dead inside his home. He wasn't just anyone. He was the Reverend, the gentle constant in a town built on faith and routine. His death didn't just break a silence, it shattered an illusion that small towns are safe simply because they are quiet. This is the story of that rupture. A house designed for peace, a murder with no warning, and the unsettling truth that even in the calmest places, violence waits for an unlocked door. This is Brick and Blood, South African Town Tales. On the morning of Sunday, 15 September 2019, the sun rose as it always did in Gouritsmond, slowly and without spectacle. Light filtered through the eucalyptus trees and washed across the sea-facing cottages. A few neighbors gathered outside the cafe near the river mouth, sipping coffee, exchanging greetings. In a town like this, silence doesn't raise any concern. It is expected. But that morning, silence pressed a little heavier. Reverend John Barnard had been a minister in the Dutch Reformed Church for decades before retiring to Gouritsmond. He was known not only for his sermons, but for his long walks along the river path, his soft-spoken presence at every funeral and wedding, and the way he remembered everyone's birthday. He had served in communities across the Western Cape, eventually choosing Gouritsmond as the place where he would see out his days in peace. But that peace ended violently. Reverend John Barnard, 87 years old, had not been seen all weekend. He was meant to attend a lunch that Sunday, something he never missed. The invitation had come from a long-time friend in the congregation, someone who had once sung in the church choir when Barnard still led services. When the elderly minister didn't arrive, concern shifted quickly into action. A neighbor, accompanied by a member of the congregation, walked to his home, a modest face brick cottage tucked between a low hedge on Dupree Street. The gate wasn't locked. The front door gave way with just a push. Inside, the air was still. No radio, no kettle boiling, just the distant sound of wind. They found him in the living room, lying motionless on the tiled floor, and there was blood. The room showed no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no shattered glass. The Bible rested neatly on the dining table, its pages slightly curled from the sea air. A chair was pulled back as though he had risen mid-thought. Within an hour, local SAPS officers sealed the scene. The body was examined and the diagnosis was grim. Blunt force trauma. No weapon was immediately found. The time of death was estimated late Saturday night or early Sunday morning. Word of his death moved quickly, first through hushed phone calls, then in disbelieving conversations outside the post office and at the cafe. Shock came not just from the murder itself, but from its location. This was Gouritsmond, a town where people didn't lock their doors, where the loudest sound at night was the wind off the dunes. 2 days later, police arrested a 33-year-old man from Bitterville. His name was unfortunately not released to the public at the time, but he was formally charged with murder. According to the police, the suspect had been in the area recently. Some believe that he had done some odd jobs for people in the town, but no one could confirm exactly how or when he crossed paths with Reverend Barnard. The SAPS initially listed robbery as the suspected motive, but nothing obvious was taken. The television remained on its shelf. The fridge was fully stocked. Barnard's phone was found in its cradle. His wallet, placed neatly on a dresser, still contained cash. That left more questions than answers. If it had been a robbery, why had the scene been so undisturbed? Why was the violence so targeted? One man, one room, no chaos. Reverend Barnard's funeral was held at the Dutch Reformed Church in town. It is a whitewashed building with an iron bell and wooden pews worn smooth by decades of prayer. More than 200 people attended, many from the surrounding towns. The service was somber. The hymns were sung with trembling voices. There was no eulogy that could make sense of the violence. What followed was an even deeper silence, the kind that seeps into walls, the kind that lingers. The house still stands. Fresh paint covers the gate. The grass is mowed. The curtains are different now. But the street speaks in half thoughts when the topic turns to what happened there. The accused never returned to town. The case was quietly resolved. Barnard's name faded from the headlines, though not from memory. The ocean kept rising and falling. The river kept winding toward it. The lighthouse blinked on and blinked off. And a small, unassuming town built on silence and stone learned how to carry the weight of an absence no one had expected. Reverend John Barnard lived in a house built for solitude. One level, face brick, iron roof, a garden just big enough to keep the world at bay. It's the kind of house that doesn't announce itself, because in Gouritsmond, there's no one to impress. The aesthetic is modesty, privacy, order, and with it comes a dangerous assumption that quietness means safety. But this story, Reverend Barnard's story, reminds us that architecture can't shield us from chaos, and that towns, like homes, often disguise their vulnerabilities beneath a surface of stillness. In Gouritsmond, everything appears designed to repel trouble. There's a lighthouse at the mouth of the river, but for decades it hasn't needed to warn of much. The roads curl like gentle waves. The houses sit politely behind their shrubs. There are no High walls, no fences with spikes. It's a town that assumes goodness. And yet, that's precisely what made the crime feel so rupturing. Not just that violence occurred, but that it occurred here in Gouritsmond, when a man like Reverend Barnard, who preached compassion, who never retired from being kind, is murdered in the very home he'd chosen for peace. We are forced to confront a truth we like to ignore, that violence can enter any door we forget to lock, and sometimes it walks in quietly. There is a myth in small coastal towns that crime lives somewhere else, says Professor Marley Strydom, a criminologist at Stellenbosch University who studies rural vulnerability. Quote, we romanticize quietness as safety, but isolated places, especially those with aging populations, can actually become soft targets for opportunistic crimes. End quote. Barnard's home wasn't fortified. Why would it be? It was built in an era and in a place where that wasn't necessary. A single pane of glass between the living room and the outside world. A wooden door that latched but didn't need to deadbolt. A town so trusting that people still leave keys under rocks or behind gas meters. Gouritsmond is an architectural time capsule where function and humility have always outweighed security. The houses here whisper the same message. This is a safe place. You can relax here. But architecture is more than materials. It's a conversation between fear and comfort. And in Gouritsmond, comfort had won until the night it didn't. There's another layer to why this story matters. Reverend Barnard was the moral center of the town, not just a retired church leader, but a fixture of the community, a living reminder of stability. He was someone people turned to in crisis, and in that irony lies the deepest fracture, that even a spiritual anchor can become vulnerable in isolation. This wasn't a case of a public figure with enemies. It wasn't political. It wasn't vigilante. It wasn't personal in any traceable way. And perhaps that's what's the most disturbing element of all, because we want our crimes to make sense. We want motives. We want stories that follow narrative arcs. But what happens when the story has no moral logic? What happens when a good man dies for no good reason inside a house that held decades of peace? Crimes that occur in contradiction to a space's perceived identity are deeply destabilizing, says Dr. Deneo Kukumur, a psychologist who specializes in trauma in rural communities. Quote, it's not just that someone was killed, it's that the symbolic heart of the town was pierced. The house stops being a house, the town stops feeling like home. End quote. Violence doesn't always announce itself with warning signs. Sometimes it arrives softly. Sometimes it slips through the cracks we didn't know were there. We often associate violent crime with visible decline, urban decay, poverty, tension. But the architecture of Gouritsmond shows none of that. And yet, even here it happened. That tells us something very uncomfortable. That danger doesn't need a setting, it only needs an opportunity. Quote, architecture can lull us into a false sense of permanence, says Dr. Annel Badenhorst, an architect and urban safety consultant. She further says, homes designed for privacy and retreat, like Barnard's, often lack passive surveillance. There are fewer eyes on the street. That's what makes spaces feel safe, but also what makes them more vulnerable when things go wrong. End quote. In that sense, Reverend Barnard's murder is not an outlier. It's a case study in vulnerability. Gouritsmond is a place that resists change in its dunes, its lighthouse, its rhythm. But even here, time does not pass without shadows. The murder of Reverend John Barnard shook not just a town, but a belief that faith brings safety, that small towns mean immunity from violence. Gouritsmond remains quiet, but that quiet now carries weight. It asks questions no tide can wash away. Who do we protect? What truths do we overlook? And how do we honor lives after the headlines have faded? Thank you for listening, for walking this quiet town with me, step by step, echo by echo. Next time, we'll travel to another South African town where architecture, memory, and crime converge once more. If this story moved you, if you believe that small towns carry big truths, please help me keep telling them. Like and subscribe to Brick and Blood South African Town Tales on your favorite podcast app. And if you are watching on YouTube, please hit the like button, subscribe, and share this episode with someone who needs to hear it. Until then, walk softly, listen deeply, and remember, every wall has a story.